They took his children, his health, and his fortune, but they could never take his silence. This is the sound of a man still praising. Welcome to Midnight Psalms, where we uncover sacred stories whispered in the dark. If your soul aches for faith that endures the storm, you've come to the right place. The wind howled through the broken walls of what used to be a home. Dust danced in the silence where children once laughed, and ashes buried the memories Job had built for years. He sat in the dirt, surrounded by shattered dreams and the mocking glances of those who once called him blessed. His skin burned with sores that no balm could soothe, but even greater was the weight in his soul, the weight of questions left unanswered. Why would a good man suffer like this? Why did the heavens stay silent while everything was taken from him? And yet, amid the ruins, there was no scream, no rebellion, no curse, only breath, slow and steady, and lips that refused to betray the one he still called God. The people watched, waiting for him to snap. They leaned in, expecting him to scream at the skies, to spit bitter words and finally crumble under the cruelty of it all. But Job didn't give them that satisfaction. His silence wasn't weakness, it was worship in its rawest form. Every second he remained still, he preached louder than sermons. He praised through the pain, not with music or dance, but with restraint. The kind of restraint that comes from knowing God, even when you don't understand him. He didn't need applause or explanation. He just needed that quiet space where pain and reverence collide. That space became his altar. When his friends arrived, they barely recognized him. They sat in silence for 7 days, overwhelmed by the sight of his suffering. But when they opened their mouths, their words stung deeper than his sores. They accused, analyzed, and moralized, convinced that Job must have sinned to deserve such ruin. But Job knew better. Not that he was perfect, but he knew pain isn't always punishment. He listened. He grieved. He defended himself. But even when misunderstood, he never abandoned the God he couldn't explain. He didn't lash out at them with rage. Instead, he praised through protest, holding on to integrity like a fragile ember in a storm. There's something sacred about praising God when it makes no sense. Job had every reason to walk away. Every loss screamed abandon him. Yet, he stayed. He stayed in the dust. Stayed in confusion. Stayed with scars that told stories no one wanted to hear. And in that staying, he became a testament, not of perfection, but of persistence. Of raw, bleeding faith. Of praise that doesn't need a reason. It was a melody unheard by human ears but thunderous in the courts of heaven. Sometimes, the loudest worship is a whisper that refuses to die. And Job whispered. Day after day. The heavens were quiet, but not absent. God watched. Not with indifference, but with divine purpose. Job's life was not a stage for punishment, it was a battlefield of glory. Every moment he chose faith over fury, he shattered the enemy's lies. Satan had bet that Job would curse God to his face. But Job didn't. Even when his own wife told him to give up, to curse and die, Job spoke one of the most haunting lines in Scripture. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble? His question wasn't a philosophical debate. It was a declaration. A confession of someone who knew that God is not just the God of the sunshine, but of the storm. Silence became Job's offering. Not because he had nothing to say, but because words would cheapen the depth of his worship. His heart was broken, but it was still God's. His life was wrecked, but still surrendered. There's a type of praise that can only rise from rubble. Job found it. Not in hymns, but in holding on. Not in blessings, but in barrenness. He didn't wear his pain like a badge. He wore it like a robe of humility, a covering that made his prayers heavier and holier. Even when he questioned God, he never quit on God. That's what made his silence praise. Job's silence spoke louder than his suffering. It told the heavens and the hells that real faith isn't transactional. It doesn't disappear when the gifts are gone. It remains when the bank is empty, the house is quiet, and the body is failing. That kind of faith is rare. It's uncomfortable. It doesn't fit on social media quotes or cute devotionals. But it's real. It's raw. And it's eternal. That's the kind of faith Job had. The kind that bleeds and still believes. The kind that aches and still adores. The kind that praises, not because life is good, but because God still is. And in that silence, God began to move. Not right away. Not with quick fixes. But with a presence that filled the emptiness Job had been sitting in. When God finally spoke, it wasn't with sympathy, it was with sovereignty. "Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation?" He asked, not to crush Job, but to remind him. Remind him that there is a wisdom higher than pain. A design deeper than despair. And even though Job never got all the answers, he got something better, an encounter. A voice that shattered the silence he had endured so faithfully. And that voice restored him. But restoration wasn't the reward. The reward was the relationship. Job said, "My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you." That is what silent praise births, revelation. Not the kind that's taught, but the kind that's lived. You only get it in the dust. In the wait. In the long, sleepless nights when all you have is tears and yet, somehow, still, trust. Job was never the same. Not because of what he got back, but because of who he became. He didn't just survive the storm, he was transformed by it. And his story still speaks, not just of pain, but of praise that doesn't quit. If you are enjoying this video, please like, subscribe and hit the notification bell to help this channel reach more people. Now let's continue. Job's story is not about suffering alone, it's about worship that has teeth, worship that can stand in the face of everything collapsing and still whisper, "Though he slay me, yet will I hope in him." That is not blind faith. It's battle-worn trust. The kind that is forged in fire and silence. Job didn't just lose things, he lost everything that defined his identity in the eyes of men. And yet, in the eyes of God, that silence was golden. It was the sound of surrender. A silence filled with meaning. A space where heaven leaned in and hell stepped back. Because a man who can worship with nothing is a threat to everything darkness builds its kingdom on. This is the part we rarely understand. Silence is not the absence of faith, sometimes it is its fullest expression. When Job stopped arguing, stopped answering, and simply waited, he wasn't giving up, he was giving in. Not to despair, but to the divine. He bowed not in defeat, but in devotion. His silence wasn't void, it was sacred. The world measured his worth by what he lost. God measured it by what he held on to. And in holding on, Job became more than a man, he became a mirror. A reflection of a faith that can walk through fire and not smell like smoke. A life that shows us how to praise when it hurts the most. Even in his darkest hour, Job taught us something radical. It's okay to question, but don't disconnect. It's okay to grieve, but don't give up on God. His silence wasn't absence, it was intimacy. The kind of deep soul stillness that only happens when you stop talking and start trusting. He didn't post about his pain. He didn't prove his innocence to everyone. He just lived it, breathed through it, and let his scars become sentences in a conversation between him and the divine. And that conversation didn't need an audience. It just needed authenticity. That's what Job gave God, all of himself, even the broken parts. In a world that tells us to shout our pain, Job invites us into a quieter kind of strength. A faith that doesn't need applause. A praise that doesn't need platforms. The kind of devotion that looks like sitting in the ashes and refusing to let bitterness win. He didn't write a book on how to suffer well. He became the book. And generations have read his silence like poetry. A slow, burning worship that says, "I may not understand this, but I still choose you." And that choice, made in the quiet, is louder than any sermon. Louder than the cries of loss. Louder than the lies of the enemy. Louder than even death. God could have stopped the storm. But he didn't. Not because he's cruel, but because sometimes storms are classrooms. And Job graduated with scars, not medals. But those scars spoke. They said, "I have seen the fire and I'm still here." And when he came out, he didn't just receive double, he received depth. Job's silence had built something stronger than wealth, it built worship. Unshakable, undistracted, unexplainable worship. The kind that doesn't need everything to be right to declare that God still is. That's what makes his story unforgettable. Not the restoration, but the reverence. Not the ending, but the endurance. Even now, his silence echoes. It echoes in hospital rooms where prayers go unanswered, in late-night sobs when the heavens feel like brass, in funerals where faith feels fragile. And yet, in all that silence, Job is still speaking, reminding us that faith isn't about the outcome, it's about the offering. And sometimes, the offering is our silence, our still standing, our not walking away, our refusal to let go of a God we can't always feel, but somehow still believe in. That is the miracle of Job. Not that he was healed, but that he never left the altar, even when the fire consumed everything else. Job's friends had words, but only Job had worship. The difference? Words analyze, worship anchors. They tried to fix what only God could finish. Job didn't argue his way into healing, he waited his way into revelation. And that waiting, wrapped in silence, was worship in its purest form. It's the kind of waiting that bleeds but believes, that cracks but clings, that suffers but still surrenders. And that silence wasn't passive, it was defiant. A holy defiance that says, I will not let go. I will not walk away. I will not trade this pain for bitterness. I will praise, even here. He was a man stripped bare before heaven. No title, no children, no wealth, just skin and sores and silence. And God saw it all. Not one sigh went unnoticed. Not one tear wasted. That silence was a sacred language, one that angels understood, one that demons feared. And when God finally spoke, he didn't apologize, he revealed. Because that's what Job needed. Not explanations, but presence. And in that presence, everything changed. Job had been asking why. But God answered with who. And the moment Job saw God, really saw him, the silence gave birth to worship that would never again be shaken. So here's the truth. Your silence matters. Your stillness in the storm echoes in eternity. Every moment you choose to stay when it would be easier to run, that is praise. Every breath you take when despair tries to suffocate you, that is praise. Every tear you cry when hope seems lost but you still whisper his name, that is praise. And like Job, you may not understand the silence around you. But if you hold on, if you remain, you'll discover the silence within you is speaking louder than you know. Because some of the most powerful worship is not sung, it's survived. If this story stirred something in you, share it with someone who needs a quiet kind of strength. And if you're walking through your own silence, remember, Midnight Psalms is here to sit in the dark with you, until morning comes.